Hello and welcome. I'm Yamini, joined today by Paul Vorback from Academy Global. Today, we're talking about the relationship between company boards and their chief risk officers, and a gap that quietly opens up between them. Boards and risk leaders often think they're aligned on risk, right up until something goes wrong. So we'll look at why the gap exists and what it costs and the practical shifts that close it. So, Paul, let's start at the top. There's this idea of an expectation gap between boards and chief risk officers. What is it, and why does so much of closing it come down to shifting from reactive to proactive risk management?
It is a challenge, and there are multiple facets to this challenge as I see it. If we zoom out from the risk perspective initially, I think we can start to see why problems in understanding can arise between boards and management, and boards in particular in the senior risk role, commonly but not always headed by a chief risk officer. There's always a tension in boards and senior executives between the extent to which board members are involved with operational level matters. So in fulfilling their responsibilities as directors, the emphasis of their roles should be in terms of governance. Now, this notion that governance and the operations of a business are somehow magically discrete is a bit of a furphy, because boards and their directors cannot undertake a sensible and serious governance role without having a sense of awareness as to what's occurring at the operating level, because that's where risks and opportunities are going to exist ultimately for the organisation. And this is true, by the way, whether we're talking about charities, we're talking about commercial organisations, or even if we're talking about government-related boards. It's not limited to company boards per se. So when it comes to questions of risk, because risk is often seen through boards, and if there's a risk and audit committee or something similar as a committee structure in place, there will be a natural gravitation to compliance. And one of the reasons for that is that directors' duties in markets like the Australian market place a very significant onus extending beyond just the potential penalties placed on the company, but right down to penalties placed on individual directors, to ensure that they are diligent, they understand the business well, and that they are prudent and ultimately effective in fulfilling their role as directors. So compliance related aspects in risk are those which are most established. And by compliance risks, I'm referring to some of the most obvious general ones, like ensuring that the company and its staff are not breaking the rules or breaking the law, ensuring that if there's particular regulation associated with the nature of the work the business is involved with. So think about mining companies and responsibilities for environment, for example, some very particular legislation and regulations that apply for them. Organisations that whose staff may be most susceptible to physical harm, so work health and safety, or occupational health and safety, depending upon the jurisdiction. So a number of these compliance, legal, regulatory areas will be first and foremost in the minds of directors. And then, of course, when we think about the financial reporting aspects, again, there's significant body of law and regulation that governs how financial accounts are presented and how that reporting takes place. So already for most directors, irrespective of the environment they're in, there's a lot under the compliance aspect. And I think because of that, there can be an excessive weighting towards compliance. Now, compliance decisions by themselves don't generate value for a company. They protect it from harms, such as fines, such as at the extremes, criminal penalties, reputational risk, and things like this. Now, a board has a role to play beyond just compliance, and we often talk about conformance, but balancing conformance with performance. So that's where the inherent tension lies often for directors as they seek to meet their obligations in their interactions with the executive through board meetings and through committee meetings. So I think the principal challenge is getting the point of focus correct and balanced. Compliance is a minimum threshold that directors will always want to ensure is being addressed comprehensively for the reasons that I've mentioned. But if the organisation is only thinking about compliance, and if the board is only thinking about compliance, then it's not likely to grow, to develop, to expand into new markets with new products, those sorts of things that ultimately create and sustain the economic position of a business. So there's some of the tensions that I can see at a high level.
So, Paul, even with the right mindset, the board and management can still pull in different directions. How do you align the risk appetite between them, and why does the risk function need real independence to make that work?
So the tensions that exist can be partly described by what I mentioned earlier, a relatively stronger focus on compliance. It's probably also something in the mix in terms of incentives at play here as well. Now, directors will often take umbrage to the point that their approach to decisions may be more conservative because they capture and can be hit by the downside risk but don't participate in the upside risk. In other words, directors typically, and there are some significant differences to this, but generally speaking, in most governance systems, directors don't participate in bonuses which are derived from profits. So you could make an argument that says a risk aversion is greater for directors than it is likely to be for executives who may have incentives associated with bonuses and options on shares or commissions if they're senior sales and revenue generating roles. So I think there's a bit of a disconnect there in terms of the tension. That can be managed effectively, but it requires a very conscious and deliberate understanding that that tension exists. And I don't think that's often as explicit as it can be and should be. I think the other area of practical treatment to this problem is for boards and executives to recognize the limits of understanding the boards will have in terms of the operating environment of the organization. Now, boards, particularly the audit and risk committees, work quite hard and diligently in most cases in trying to get an eye into that environment. But boards will never have the same degree of understanding of the internal technical operating environment from where a lot, not all, of risks will ultimately emanate from. The other part which is problematic is that often, even across the executive leadership team in an organization, there'll be varying degrees of understanding of the language of risk. And by the language of risk, I mean, I include literally the language of risk down to, the differences between definitions of risk appetite, risk tolerance, how we describe probability, expected values. So this is a problem even between members on the executive, and that problem also extends between executive and board as well. Now, you would think that if there are these pockets of disconnect, that it would be somewhat obvious that these should be put overtly on the table and addressed openly and constructively. In my experience, it's often not. And I think there's several reasons for this, and it's not unique to the risk conversation, but I've seen this occurring more frequently, probably around risk conversations. The first is in their very natural desire and attempt to convey competence around risk, executives are hesitant often to reveal any deficits they have in terms of knowledge, understanding, or limitations to their vocabulary or expertise in risk. So that's not something which will be volunteered lightly. And similarly, and in some respects more of a problem, is the boards themselves and the directors are often reticent perhaps to reveal to each other and to the most senior executives where this conversation might arise, chief executive, chief financial officer, chief risk officer, chief operating officer, that perhaps they're not sufficiently equipped and familiar with the language and the tools that need to be at that threshold level for rich risk conversations to take place. So there are some of the factors that I've seen that I think mean that there's a hidden space, there's a grey zone where we're not talking as frankly and openly about risk, what we know, what we don't know, the language we use, even the tools and the techniques that we use to do an excellent job of it.
So, coming to my next question, how do directors build enough risk expertise to oversee this role? And how does risk reporting need to change so those conversations are actually meaningful?
Yes, so we can think about different levels of maturity that exist in relation to risk competencies. And that level of maturity will vary by individual on the board. Hopefully within a risk committee, there won't be quite the same delta or difference in understanding what we might describe as the technical toolkit and vocabulary. But I think the logical starting point is to do a skills assessment. Now, these are always conversations that need and processes that need to be thought through carefully and sometimes delicately, where you've got seasoned and experienced directors who've perhaps have held multiple board positions for a long period of time, for them to go through a process of potential reckoning that maybe they're not quite as developed in some of these areas as what might be most expected of them in the current environment, because expectations of executives and they extend to boards are much higher now in risk management than what we've seen in decades gone past, particularly in some of the areas of non-physical risks. And by that, I'm referring to things like psychosocial hazards, internal work-related risks have a different level of significant and understanding and impact if not handled well. And that's even before we get into emerging risks like cyber risks and even geopolitical related risks. So I think the first point is an open upfront process of respectful discovery of where are we strong, where might there need to be some gaps, or even where there might be some inconsistencies in understanding and our approaches to risk management. I think that needs to be handled, as I say, with diplomacy, but I think it's got to be done. It can't not be left to itself. The other aspect in relation to this is to understand what are the existing artifacts and tools and frameworks that the organisation uses. And I think the board should have a role in certainly at first understanding those and the assumptions that sit behind how those tools have been developed and whether they continue to be fit for purpose. But also I think boards need to understand how executive use them. Now, for some people hearing that comment, they would say that's getting too into the reeds operationally. But I think at the moment, it's reasonable to expect a line of sight for directors to know how risk processes are being undertaken. To simply rely as a board member on a pre-concocted risk matrix, which ends up with different risk treatments being applied and a description of inherent risks and residual risks, and looking at that on a heat map or a risk matrix, to me, is not sufficient value. I think boards need to understand how do we get to those risk assessments and what were the processes of risk analysis that led to those scores being arrived at. I'm not sure if that happens as much as what it should happen. The other thing, and this is always challenging in terms of the reporting part of your question, and that relates to how much detail does the board need to see? So for most medium to larger size organisations, you need to have different risk registers at play. So you may have operational level risk registers that may focus on one part of the organisation's activities, but then ultimately the board needs to understand what those outlier risks are at the operational level. So for example, if risks have been identified that even allowing for treatment still have a profile of, say, a medium or high level of what we call residual risk exposure, they should be communicated and transported across into the whole of board or whole of enterprise risk register. Now, there's a real threshold point around the time, interest and energy that boards have to engage themselves in in-depth discussions on risk. So a critical discussion needs to be what is the right length, size of our risk register, and how is a risk register, for example, used by the board to stimulate constructive thinking and constructive discussions with senior executives as well. So right sizing those types of tools like risk registers becomes very, very important. And probably the last thing which I would suggest is that boards, because of the compensation of their non-executive directors, have a unique opportunity to capture what we call strategic risks. So executives within the organisations will very often be the domain experts. They'll be focusing very closely on the markets they're in, on the particular legislation that they have to comply with. Boards of directors are comprised of people who are often straddling across different industries. They may have portfolios across public and private sector, and therefore they're probably well equipped to be able to pick up on those emergent and strategic risks that might be missed by the executives. So that's a very particular opportunity for complementing executives that non-executive directors, board members can bring to the executive through their risk processes.
And Paul, coming to my final question, for boards and risk leaders wanting to close this gap rather than just talk about it, where should they start?
There are a number of excellent programs available for directors on the topic of risk, as there are for executives as well. I would encourage anybody who's watching this clip to have a look at organisations such as the Australian Institute of Company Directors. The Governance Institute of Australia, again, has programs in this area. The Institute of Strategic Risk Management, for whom Academy Global is a partner, also has programs across risk management from operational levels right through to the board as well. So I'd encourage some research, have a look at the topic areas, and ask questions of organisations about how do they approach the teaching of risk management and how relevant is it for their context.
And thank you, Paul. That's a really clear picture of how boards and risk leaders close that gap from mindset through reporting. So thank you for explaining that to us, and thank you all for watching.